What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're back for day 3 of the Grotsmas calendar. We're talking about the new detachments coming out for Warhammer 40k for every week of December up until Christmas. I even made a playlist on my channel because I'm committing to do one every day for every detachment that comes out. As always, we're going to talk about the detachment, strengths and weaknesses, ways you can play it, as well as doing a list breakdown at the end, and I will continue to do these as long as people watch them. Please like and subscribe. Do all the YouTube stuff. I'll give you my best puppy dog eyes to please share it around to all your friends, and then we can do more of them. Today we're talking Tyranids because we had the Tyranid Warrior Bioform detachment. This detachment focuses very heavily on the titular Tyranid heavy infantry.
Roger, what alliteration.
The warrior, and unlocks some new ways to play Tyranids with a warrior focus. So what does the Warrior Bioform Onslaught detachment do? It has a little bit of a convoluted detachment rule, so let's break it down by parts. First off, Tyranid Warriors and Winged Tyranid Primes get a 5+ invulnerable save. Thank God! These things have trash armor saving throws, so having an invulnerable save is huge. Now, that Tyranid Warrior distinction is an important one. The detachment also includes a keyword section that explains it, specifically Tyranid Warriors with ranged bioweapons and Tyranid Warriors with melee bioweapons gain the Tyranid Warrior and Battle Line keywords. So those two units in particular can be taken in up to 6, and they get all the Battle Line benefits that you get from playing Pry and Nexus. Importantly, this does not affect the Winged Tyranid Prime. So Winged Tyranid Primes are not Battle Line. They also don't improve their OC value. It is only the ranged and melee bioweapon warrior datasheets that get this ability. So despite literally being a Tyranid Warrior, that it literally has melee bioweapons, the Winged Tyranid Prime is not included with this. It does get that 5+ invulnerable save. However, like we talked about in the last video where we talked about Dark Angels, this OC characteristic replacement effect has a rider on it that it doesn't work while you're battle shocked. This is a replacement, so if it did work while you're battle shocked, you could, for example, retain OC3 during your turn, even while being battle shocked. Just like the Dark Angels detachment, that's why that battle shocked rider is important. Now let's talk about enhancements, and these are really straightforward. Probably the most straightforward enhancements we've seen in almost any detachment. For 10 points, Synaptic Tyrant allows a Neuro Tyrant to attach to a Tyranid Warriors unit. That's cool, I guess. Gives him +1 to hit. All right. I don't know why it costs extra points to do that, but, you know, it is what it is, I guess. You could be attaching to Zone Throws, but instead you're choosing to join in with trash Tyranid Warriors, so we'll see how it goes. Ocular Adaptation. It's a big one. This one costs you 20 points, gives you +1 to hit. It is a Winged Tyranid Prime model only, and in effect bears entire unit. Unfortunately, this doesn't check whether you're making ranged or melee attacks. It works on both of them. So if you're attaching it to a ranged Tyranid Warrior unit, for example, you can be hitting on 3s with your guns and 2s with your melee, which is pretty cool. And it can also affect gargoyles potentially if you're attaching into them too, which is kind of sweet. Sensory Assimilation is basically the opposite. Same requirements. You can be only a Winged Tyranid Prime, but it gives you -1 to hit each time an enemy attack targets the bear's unit. Again, doesn't care whether it's melee or ranged, so you could do something like attach this into 20 gargoyles and make them -1 to hit in melee. So a pretty good screen at that, which is kind of cool, although expensive. Now, speaking of expensive, the big one for the detachment is Elevated Might. This gives you the ability to advance and charge. This is probably going to be played every time here because it does make melee bioweapon warriors kind of like viable at all. They're really slow, besides from the Tyranid Prime you're attaching to the unit. However, this could be assigned to anything, so you could put it on something like a Hive Tyrant potentially, give his entire unit advance and charge, which is kind of cool. But the big one I think is going to be Winged Tyranid Primes because that's the focus of the detachment, and that's where most of their abilities and stratagems are keying off of. So now, speaking of that, let's talk about some stratagems for the detachment. And one thing that I think is interesting about the stratagems here is that while the focus is definitely ranged Tyranid Warriors, that's not the entire use case of most of these effects. You can either apply them to multiple units, and several of these stratagems can apply to a warrior unit and an Endless Multitude unit that's nearby them, so they can kind of broadcast the effect of the stratagem out. But many of them can also just be used on anything in your army and maybe have an enhanced effect on Tyranid Warriors. So this detachment ends up being fairly flexible. And I think that's smart design because the way that Tyranids have been constructed in 10th edition is that they almost always require a backline of ranged attackers. Things like Excrins and Tyrannofexes just to be able to keep parity with attritionally with their opponent because their frontline units don't do anything. So they have to rely on their efficient gunline units to actually actually deal damage. And if the detachment had no benefits for them whatsoever, I think it would really, really bad and nobody would play it. So this is actually composed in a way that might actually see play, which is good. The first stratagem is Synaptic Amplification. You target a Tyranid unit from your army that has not been selected to shoot or fight. If you are a Tyranid warrior unit, you can, as I mentioned before, broadcast the effect of this stratagem to up to one Endless Multitude unit. So that's things like Gants and Hormagons that is not battle shocked and within 6 inches. Until the end of the phase, each time a model in those units makes an attack, reroll a wound roll of 1. If it is a Tyranid warriors unit, reroll a hit roll of 1. So there's basically 3 different applications for this. You can use it on anything to give it reroll wounds of 1. You can use it on Tyranid warriors to give it reroll hits and wounds of 1. Or you can use it on both Tyranid warriors and an Endless Multitude unit to get reroll hits and wounds of 1 on the warriors and reroll wounds of 1 only on the Endless Multitude unit. A little confusing, but there are a lot of different options for use of this. First of all, it's reroll wounds of 1, which is great. You're probably, especially if you're shooting guns, already getting hit rerolls of 1. Tanks from exocrines, so getting wounds of 1 for 1 CP is solid. You're never going to say no to that. But being able to shore up, especially like ranged bioweapon Tyranid warriors, is pretty nice. The melee warriors won't really use this at all because they can already get reroll hits of 1 with their own ability and they're twin linked in melee, so they don't really use this. But the other units in the army is really where you want to be using this. I think it's also probably pretty good on like big monsters in melee. You could potentially put it on something like a Haru Specs that makes 1,000,000 attacks and get wound rerolls of 1 in there as well, which is cool. I've said wound rerolls of 1 so many times it's like losing meaning in my head. Spontaneous Hyper Corrosion is the next one. This is probably one of the highlights of the detachment. It's usable in the shooting phase or the fight phase, but again, it has different modes that it applies depending on the keywords that you have. It selects 1 Tyranid unit from your army, so not keyword restricted, and adds +2 to the strength characteristic of their ranged weapons. In addition, if you are a warrior unit, you also add 1 to the strength characteristic of melee weapons. We have to remember that since the Synapse update, Tyranids warriors are always base +1 strength because they are Synapse creatures themselves, so they broadcast an aura of +1 strength that they are themselves affected by. So this will add 2 to the strength characteristic that's listed on their datasheet. This makes melee bioweapon warriors strength 7, and that is a big deal. That's why this stratagem exists. Right now, Tyranid warriors have basically no way to crack through a T12 enemy. This makes it so. They can finally actually wound on 5s, and they are twin linked, so they have about a 50-50 pass-through rate on the wound roll, which is good enough to punch through many of those units, especially if you shot them and done some damage earlier on in the turn. If you can source +1 to wound from a Neurolictor, for example, they go kind of insane, but obviously that's a little bit tougher to do. But generally speaking, just +2 strength on ranged weapons would already be pretty good. Tyranid ranged weapons tend to be very middling. They have a lot of like strength 9, strength 10 weapons, and pushing those to strength 11 or strength 12 means that they can actually punch through enemy armored vehicles much more easily. So this is a solid stratagem to have. Restorative Impulse is the next one. It's used in your command phase. You target a Tyranid warrior unit that is below starting strength and return a model back to the unit. That's it. But given that these are OC3 models and this happens in your command phase before you score, you have the opportunity to potentially take objectives from enemies. So that seems pretty good. I think most of the time, if you have below starting strength warrior units, you're going to be windmill slamming this on the table just to get those relatively high value models back. The next stratagem is kind of a nice quality of life one to have. I actually sort of misread this one. when I was originally recording this video, and I was like, whoa, it's an objective control, it's an OBSEC, objective secured stratagem. You use it 1 CP, you pay it if you control an objective, and you lock it under your control until your opponent takes it. I was excited by the fact that it has a movement phase timing, because theoretically you could like move up to an objective and then lock it on your turn, but that's not really how it works. If you have an objective that you didn't control, and then you move a warrior unit onto it in order to use the stratagem, you don't check level of control on the objective until the end of that phase. So you can't use it if you don't control the objective at the start of the phase. The only reason that the movement phase timing matters for the stratagem is so that you can like hold an objective and then with a different unit, like a gargoyle or something, and then move a Tyranid warrior to it and then lock it with that Tyranid warrior. But it still requires basically that you hold the objective at the end of your command phase and then allows you to lock it in. This is totally fine. These are like nice stratagems to have. It has taken a little bit of the wind out of my sails though, because I thought this would work kind of like the Chaos Demon version of the stratagem where you can use it on your opponent's turn to lock objectives and sort of force them to come out and fight you. And since you can't do that. I don't know. Your opponent's just gonna like dodge all your slow ass stupid Tyranid warriors. That's fine. It's a good stratagem. Next one is Parasitic Payload. This is also a nice one to have in addition to Spontaneous Hypercorrosion. I think a lot of this detachment is basically going to be pumping CP into kind of mediocre range units and making them much more effective. Parasitic Payload gives your unit ignore cover, and then after you've resolved your shooting attacks, you select one enemy unit hit by one or more of your attacks. That enemy unit loses the benefit of cover. This is huge. Normally, Tyranids had to rely on Pyrobores to do this in the past, which are just like the most obnoxious units to play in the world. 5-inch move model on a 4-inch wide base. Like, how are you supposed to maneuver that? I have no idea. Parasitic Payload just lets you do it on any Tyranid warrior unit with guns for 1 CP. Pretty solid. A lot of these are going to get discounted by Hive Tyrants, by the way. So a lot of these are going to be used once or twice a battle round for free, which means that Tyranids of anyone do have the CP to pump into their mediocre shooting units to make them much better. The weird part about it is that ranged bioweapon Tyranid warrior units are like really swingy on their attacks. They fire a random number of shots at a 4+ ballistic skill. So the downside of the stratagem is that you have to declare it before you know if you're hitting. So it's not a stratagem where you can use like when you hit a target to then strip cover from them. You have to use it when you're or before you're selected to shoot. You then select targets and shoot, but if you miss all your attacks against this particular enemy that you wanted to strip cover from, they're not eligible to be affected by the removal of cover part of the strat. So that's like weird. There's definitely going to be situations where you're like, oh, I'll dump this on this 3-man warrior unit, fire a Venom Cannon and a Barb Strangler at someone, and then miss them. Do nothing. Classic Tyranids. Synaptic Shield is the last one, and this is definitely a through line that we're seeing through these Grotsmas detachments. It is a bodyguard effect that is conditional. So it's a 1 CP stratagem. You can use it only in the shooting phase, so you can't use it against melee attacks. It's important to note. You target a Tyranid warrior unit from your army that was selected as the target of an enemy shooting attack, and if the strength characteristic of the attack is higher than your toughness, it gets -1 to wound. This is great. A lot of like big punchy anti-heavy infantry weapons are strength like 6 to 9, just good enough to wound warriors on 3s and be pretty efficient against them. If you can push those to 4s, they get way worse, way less consistent at killing Tyranid warriors. And when you're also stacking on top of that things like hit penalties and a 5+ invulnerable save, these warriors can actually be really sticky to kill. Like a big blast, 3 damage blast weapon that would normally rip an entire Tyranid warrior unit off the table now kills maybe half of them. You restorative impulse, bring one back, and suddenly you're almost back to full fighting strength, even after getting shot. This also has this pulse effect. Interestingly, there is a clause that the additional target effect only applies if you are a Tyranid warrior unit, but only Tyranid warrior units can be selected by the stratagem, so that's funny. But you can then project the effect of the stratagem onto another Endless Multitude unit within 6 inches. Given that those are always toughness 3, that's a big deal. That's going to make those guys much tougher to kill because like 99% of attacks in the game are going to be higher strength than their toughness. So that's really cool, and I definitely think that there are going to be situations where you can, for example, be broadcasting this effect onto like those gargoyles that I talked about before that are -1 to hit already. You can then also be -1 to be wounded and punching through like 20 models with that. Defensive characteristic is super duper tough. So that's really cool. I really like, so that's really cool. That's going to be a huge quality of life improvement for Tyranid warriors. And I think in general, the detachment is doing its best to make Tyranid warriors as good as we can be. So we have a lot of potentially stacking effects, things like -1 to be hit and a 5+ invulnerable save going together to make these units tougher to kill. You also then get some ranged buffs and some melee buffs as well to try to allow them to punch up in the fight phase and shooting phase as well. So we're really trying to sort of kind of like force through this Tyranid warrior archetype. The weird part about this, and the part that's really disappointing for me personally, is that it's just more of the same for Tyranids, man. It is a new archetype in that it is basically doing the Tyranid shtick, but with a different unit. You're doing Tyranid warriors instead of I don't know, Maleceptors or Norn emissaries or something. Largely, your game plan is identical. This isn't really shaking up the faction in any way. And to be fair, most of these Grotsmas detachments, although the only 3 that we've talked about so far, have been kind of like this, where they basically have added a new way to play kind of the same list that you always played. It seems totally fine. So let's dive into a list composition using this detachment. So here we are constructing a list over with our friends at New recruit. Now, obviously, I am proxying in, what are we doing today? Invasion Fleet. The points aren't 100% correct because we don't have enough 20-point enhancements in here, but we should have 5 additional points in this detachment to spend. Importantly as well, where this is going to give me an error for ranged bioweapon warrior units because these should have battle lines, so they should be a field allowance of 6. Here's where we're going today, everybody. We're starting with the Hive Tyrant, largely because he gives the assault aura to our guns, which is going to affect not only the ranged bioweapon warrior units, but also the exocrines that we're also taking in the list, and then 3 Tyranid Primes. Now, the idea is that we're going to use the Tyranid Primes as our melee counterpunch, and what I'm trying to do today is kind of force through a warrior spam style of list. I think that there is a pretty reasonable combined arms style. You can do things like take Neurotyrants and Zoanthropes in order to make use of the range buffs. So you can give like wound free rolls of 1, +2 strength, and also ignore cover to a Zoanthrope unit, and you can actually make them very do a bunch of damage. That's a pretty good way to play. As I mentioned before, there's also some weird stuff you can do with like Tyranid Primes where they can push forward to get a bunch of hit bonuses, move additional movement forward, be tough to kill, and just sort of exist in your opponent's phase for a while. I think that's pretty interesting too. What I think the most interesting way for this to play, in my opinion, is just like spamming a million Tyranid warriors, because that's cool and fun. Whether or not it's better than a simpler version out of something like Vanguard Onslaught, I don't know. But that's what we're going to be trying to do with this list today. So we have the Hive Tyrant in here. We have 3 Winged Tyranid Primes. One of them is getting the 30-point advance and charge enhancement, so we can actually get their unit to the fight sometime ever. The other units are probably, if we have favorable terrain, they can move up and stage into it like an aggressive position, or we could just rapid ingress them onto the table as well. One of them is going to get the -1 to hit enhancement. One of them is going to get the +1 to hit enhancement. The enhancements are pretty solid, so you can't be too upset about those. We have a Hormigaunt unit in here, largely just as to act as a screen or a objective disruptor. You could probably drop some additional ranged bioweapon warriors for more Hormigaunts if you need more high OC stuff to run up into the middle of the table, but we're taking 1 today. We also have a Biovore for scoring in the back line, as well as, this is a little bit of a spicy inclusion, 3 Venomthropes. Now, the Venomthropes will add cover and stealth to infantry within 6 inches of them. These guys, so if we're taking large, especially ranged bioweapon warrior units, we can string them back because they're only 6 models. They just use the 1-by-1 coherency rolls, so just every model has to be within 2 inches of another model that chains out. So you can string them back, especially with your like idiot Deathspitter guys you don't care about, to the Venomthropes to make your unit -1 to be hit. So you're potentially -1 to be hit base from the Venomthropes, -1 to be wounded from the Stratagem, and a 5+ invulnerable save on 18 wounds at T5, which isn't good, but it's also 130 points. These guys are cheap as hell. And as I talked about in my Tyranid Warrior datasheet deep dive, I actually even undervalued ranged bioweapon warriors and still thought that they were probably playable in very specific instances. And I think that OC3 and a 5+ invuln save is probably what they're looking to do in order to be good on the table. Now, these guys should also have heavy weapons, but here's the reason that they're good is that each time you take a unit of 3 of them, they get 2 heavy weapon options. They get a venom cannon and a barb strangler. So while they're only ballistics go 4 on other guns, they are firing a pretty reasonable selection of ranged attacks, and they're backing that up with 15 AP1 melee attacks for 65 points. They're so cheap. It's crazy. So these guys can fight other utility stuff all day. You want to put 10 guardsmen into a bioweapon warrior unit, you're going to kill 1 of them with all your shooting, maybe, unless you get super lucky. And then that guy's going to regrow, and then you're just going to kill the entire guardsman squad, like, for free, without even thinking about it. They're super tough to take objectives from. You can obsec, and then also, once you're stacking these additional defensive buffs on them, it just gets better and better and better. As I said before, we're then following that up with 18 melee bioweapon warriors. I think the advance and charge one starts on the table probably, and just acts as a sort of early game deterrent for people trying to come in and fight the ranged bioweapon warriors. And then we have 3 exocrines sitting in the back here. The only reason I'm really taking the big bricks here is because of this sort of Venomthrope abilities. I think largely you want to be sending out the little tiny 3-man Tyranid bioweapon warrior units to go do stuff, to go hold objectives and potentially try to lock objectives and act as utility units. The downside of these guys is that they are slow, so they're not quite as effective at scoring as something like a Hormigaunt unit, but obviously they're way harder to kill, so you win some, you lose some. Because we're taking 6, then they force multiply with these defensive effects quite a bit, and so the idea is that we can kind of threat overload the opponent in the center. We can run these guys into the middle, take some objectives, lock them in. At the same turn, hopefully you can commit your melee bioweapon warrior units, get them all under the -1 to hit aura, and then whichever ones you need to get -1 to be wounded. I think you could cut some of this stuff to take and potentially even cut some of the melee bioweapon warrior units. 3 might be too many, but I'm not sure yet. For stuff like Tyranofexes, if you really need that heavy armor cracking, that might be a little bit more of a metagame consideration. And if you cut a couple things, you think you have to cut a melee warrior brick and potentially a ranged warrior brick. You could get the Neurotyrant as well as the Zoanthrope unit in there too, which I do think is really good in this detachment. So a lot of optionality in there and ways you can play, but I do think that with all the defensive effects that they're piling onto these units, their capacity to survive is much greater than your opponent would maybe expect. A lot of it focuses on ranged attacks, right? The Venomthropes give stealth, so it doesn't affect melee, and the -1 to be wounded strat doesn't affect melee either. But typically, I think you're okay with your opponent committing to you with melee units, especially if they're expensive melee units, because then you can counter hit them with the melee bioweapon warriors. That's like fine with you, because all you want to do, and all Tyranids just in general want to do, is like toilet bowl the game into a big fight in the middle. And if they can do that, they're in a pretty good spot, but if their opponent jukes them, it's tough. So with that, let me know down in the comment section what you think about this detachment, as well as this build for the Warrior Bioform Onslaught. Overall, I don't think it's going to rescue Tyranids from being a boring, lame army, but it definitely gives them more ways to be boring and lame. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports me over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.